Welcome to the Register's Editorial Board. We're here with Secretary Tom Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture. We're going to do a real quick around the table introduction. I'm Lynn Hicks, opinion editor.
Clark Kaufman, editorial writer.
Rika Basu, columnist.
Janelle Eller, reporter. Anna Baxter, news director.
Jason Noble, chief political reporter.
Carol Hunter, executive editor.
Brian Smith, engagement editor.
What is an engagement?
Primarily do social media and event strategy.
Got
and
it.
Work on the editorial board as well.
Okay.
Lindsey Graham had the same question in the
A
editorial.
lot of people.
It's a common question.
Well,
So-
so probably not for millennials, but for people my age.
Secretary, you're what, 30 days out before it's over. Tell us a little bit why you wanted to visit with us before you leave your term.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I just thought it was a sort of a fitting end to the end of an 8-year run as Secretary of Agriculture to sort of end where I began, in a sense, at the Des Moines Register. You all were the ones that sort of broke the story of my appointment as Secretary, and so I just thought it was a fitting end to a great run. This has been an incredible job. It's a job that many people in the country, and even many people in the countryside, do not understand or appreciate the magnitude and the scope of the United States Department of Agriculture. I will be the first to admit I didn't understand it when I was asked almost 8 years ago to the day to assume this responsibility. But now I just have an incredible affection for the people who work at USDA and for the people we work for. And I think the President said it very well at a recent meeting of the Cabinet. The question is whether or not the department that you lead and the country that you serve is better off than it was 8 years ago. And I think I can make the case in all the mission areas of USDA that we have seen progress and that not only is the country and rural America better off, but I would say the department clearly is better off. Just last week, we were we got in the top 10 of best places to work for large agencies in the federal government. That we were at the bottom of the pack when I first became secretary. So that's been progress in terms of the morale at USDA, and we were the most improved department in large part because of our cultural transformation efforts. It's just been an incredible experience, and it's been an incredible learning experience for me personally. I have had an opportunity to learn a lot about diversity and inclusion. I inherited a department that had over 25,000 individuals who believed that they had been discriminated against. Women, Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans, Native American producers, rural folks who felt the USDA over the course of years had not treated them fairly. In terms of loan applications and in terms of requests that they were making from the department. Those claims have been settled for the most part. We went through a cultural transformation. We now have the second most diverse senior executive staff in the federal government. We've seen program complaints and EEOC complaints at record lows. So I'm very proud of the civil rights record of the department, and that really allowed us to begin the process of doing a lot of the policy work that was important. An area that I am particularly proud of and where there will always be work to do, but I think we've made progress, is in the area of our natural resources. I think our private working lands are in better shape than they were 8 years ago. There's still much to do, obviously, and certainly in the state of Iowa there's much to do, but we've been very creative and innovative about the way in which we've approached conservation. Just recently, several weeks ago, I made the announcement of the establishment of the Clean Lakes, Estuaries, and Rivers program, which has particular relevance to Iowa because it's a new tool for the Conservation Reserve Program that will allow for a 90% cost share assumption by the federal government for bioreactors and saturated buffers. These are opportunities for us to really focus on particularly difficult areas in terms of nutrient runoff and provide farmers additional tools and opportunities to consider conservation. This complements a tremendous amount of work that's been done in this administration with a record number of acres enrolled in conservation across the country, whether it's the National Water Quality Initiative, which it really focuses on smaller watersheds, which we have 6 watershed projects in Iowa of the 197 projects that have been funded nationally. Or the Conservation Innovation Grant Program that has focused on new and creative ways to deal with conservation. Again, over 20 projects funded in the state of Iowa. Or the important work that the Regional Conservation Partnership Program continues to do. This was an idea that was born out of our efforts at USDA to redefine how conservation was to be approached. In the past, it was pretty much approached on a farmer-by-farmer, tract-by-tract basis. We believe that there needs to be a coordinated and integrated effort in conservation focused on larger watersheds. So we began the process in the upper Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay area, the Colorado River Basin, and the California Bay Delta to sort of look at what large-scale watershed conservation would look like or could look like. That worked so well in the first term of the Obama administration that the Congress adopted it in the 2014 Farm Bill and created the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. They set aside roughly 7% of the Environmental Quality Incentive Program EQIP monies and 7% of the Conservation Stewardship Program acres, CSP, into a pot. And basically, over the course of the last several years, we have been taking portions of those acres and those resources and basically putting them on the table, asking for competitive grants and applications from across the country. A percentage of it is based on a national competition, a percentage is allocated to each state, and a percentage is provided to 8 critically conservation areas, of which the upper Mississippi River Basin area is actually part of 2 CCAs. And over the course of the last 3 years, we've announced, or will in the very near term, announce a total of $825 million of federal resources, and that's been matched or will be matched by $1.4 billion of additional outside resources. Partners like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, organizations like the Farm Bureau, the National Farmers Union, and corporations like Chevrolet and Coca-Cola and others have come up as part of their effort to try to work together to address some major conservation issues. And I believe that that's the future of conservation. I think you're going to see more coordination, more large-scale projects. And the reason is that we know from data that we have begun to collect that integrated, coordinated approaches involving multiple conservation practices will result in more effective soil conservation and will improve over a long period of time water quality. So we're going to continue to see that program, I think, grow. There are 2 more years of funding that the next administration will assume, and then Congress will decide in the 2017-18 time period whether to extend the program in the next Farm Bill. And I would be very surprised if it doesn't not only get extended but actually get expanded. It's been a very popular program.
Can you give me an example of what would that look like, or does it look like now in Iowa?
Well, in Iowa there are a number of projects that were focused initially on pollinator expansion, and that basically provides resources for cover crops that will attract and retain and preserve pollinators. That's a big issue, obviously, with the country. A substantial number of our agricultural products are somewhat dependent on bees and monarch butterflies. We also worked with the state Ag Department under the Midwest Agricultural Water Quality Initiative, which is state resources, federal resources in a relatively small amount, but I think it provides a pilot for what I believe this state needs, which is a much larger commitment by the state. If you look at CRP and you look at the conservation programs that we've invested since President Obama was elected in the state, you're going to see a cumulative total of over $2.5 billion have been invested by the federal government in conservation of one kind or another. It may be CRP acres, it may be CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program acres, it may be EQIP, it may be a water quality initiative, it may be an innovation grant, or it may be part of this Regional Conservation Partnership Program. But all told, that amount of money has been invested over the last 8 years. The challenge, I think, in the future is to take those resources, because they're pretty well predictable and available, and essentially make sure that they get channeled and funneled and directed in the right way, in the right place, and coordinated with outside resources from Pheasants Forever and other organizations that are interested, the Nation Conservancy and other organizations, and matched by or contributed by a larger scale commitment from the state government. And I think if you did that and you set up some kind of method by which you could ensure that you knew precisely what money was being invested where, and you had a baseline of information that would allow you to measure success, you would see greater results, and I think you would see some accountability that would reassure people that this was being addressed in a thoughtful way. And that would be my hope for the next legislative session, as it was my hope for the previous legislature, that they actually get serious about this and put some significant resources behind it. Because when you match the federal commitment, outside private sector commitment, and a state commitment, you can get some pretty serious conservation activity.
What does significant resources mean?
Well, that's obviously for policymakers to decide, but I think you're not looking at a 1 year, 2 year kind of situation where if you take aggressive action for a couple of years, you're going to see significant progress. This didn't evolve overnight. It's not going to be resolved overnight. It's going to take a long-standing commitment. So you're looking at a 5 to 10 year time frame of concentrated, significant resources being committed. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that you could see the federal government contributing a couple $2 billion as it has, and the state government looking at potentially, $500 million to $1 billion over that same time period. Now you're talking about a substantial amount of money when you add to it what outside forces or resources can be added to it, and what the farmers themselves will be able to contribute and should contribute. You're looking at a fairly significant amount of conservation activity. Not only will it benefit the soil, not only will it provide long-standing productivity of that soil, particularly in a changing climate, which is not going to get any easier for farming, but it's also going to create jobs and support jobs in the state. So I think I would hope that policymakers in the legislature, the governor's office, would see this not just as natural resource conservation, but also as economic development.
Can I ask you about APHIS? There's been some criticism of the department for just issuing licenses to kennels and breeders just based on payment of a fee, as opposed to past practices and violations and that kind of thing.
Clark, I asked my team to look into the issues that you all have raised on this issue, and there's a little bit more to the story, and I think Kevin Shea put a letter to the editor recently in the paper at my request to make sure that there was a full understanding of precisely how this operates. There has been a toughening up and tightening up of the rules and regulations, and there has been an effort on the part of APHIS with limited resources and limited staff. That's part of a challenge, I think it's important for folks to understand this. The budget I'm dealing with, the long-term budget for the department that operates the department, is roughly the same as it was when I became secretary. There has been no increase, there's been no growth, and yet we've done a record amount of work and activity. Now, we've been able to do this because we engaged in an effort to be better stewards of the taxpayer dollars. We identified savings. But nevertheless, when you see reductions, or where each year you have to absorb the salary increase, which means that you have to do the attrition thing and all that sort of thing, you see it, fewer people. And fewer people means it's harder. Having said that, part of the challenge with the kennels is that we are somewhat dependent on the judiciary, because when folks are sanctioned, they go to court and they object to the sanction. And we've received some inconsistent messages from the judiciary about how stiff we should be and how harsh we should be. On one hand, they say, go get them, and on the other hand, they go, you went too far. So, particularly in the Iowa circumstance, I think we were somewhat tied into and tied up by the litigation, as I understand it. So, I think you're going to continue to see stronger action. It is interesting in this whole issue of animal welfare. We're dealing right now with a thing called horse soring, which is a little different than puppy mills, but it has to do with Tennessee walking horses. And And to me, this is just, I don't understand why anybody would do this, but in order for that horse to basically saunter more effectively for competition, people insert in the horse some mechanism that creates some pain when they basically step down, which means they sort of step higher. So we've tried to regulate that. Whoa, we get a lot of interest from our friends in Congress on whether or not we are over-regulating and doing too much. And they have some pretty powerful friends in Congress. So I think our folks are doing what they can. I don't think they're certainly not turning a blind eye. They understand some of these places are just horrific, and they've attempted in the recent past, with more authority given to them by Congress, to be harder on folks who are not taking care of the animals.
For one thing, it seemed like, based on what we were told by your department, that if a breeder applies for a license, once they pay the fee, issuance of that license is pretty much automatic, that there's not and maybe that has to do with legislation or procedural rules.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm happy to after this editorial board meeting to find out and let you know. It may very well be that we are prohibited from doing any kind of denial based on past practices. If that's the case, I would say that's something that should be changed. Certainly in other areas of our mission, if you've violated the law, you can be either banned for a period of time or forever from participating. I'm thinking of the SNAP program. If you're playing fast and loose with the SNAP rules, you lose your ability to participate, and you lose it forever. So, but let me check into that. I just don't know the answer to that question.
You're the only remaining Secretary of Cabinet from the time that President Obama first got into office. Why do you think that is?
Well, just to be, my friend Sean Donovan always gets a little irritated when people say you're the only guy left. He's still there too, but he's in a different job. He was HUD director in 2009 when he was confirmed. He's now the OMB director. I can't speak for my colleagues in the cabinet. I don't think, now I've got to think about this. I don't think very many of them have had the experience that I had prior to being a cabinet member, which is to say they were in public life in a high-profile job like I was with being governor of a state. And I left that job, and I left it voluntarily, because I genuinely believe that there needs to be constant change. And every job I've had, I've kept for 2 terms, and that's kind of my process. But when I left the governorship, I honestly thought, and I'm sure these folks thought this as themselves, that boy, this is, I put my time in, and I'm tired, and it's time to take a break, and this has been a great job, and I'm going to find another better job, or more fun job, or whatever. And then you leave, and you realize you're not impacting and affecting people's lives in quite the same way that you did before, or that you find yourself at 4:30 in the afternoon or 5 o'clock, and you go, the workday's over, and you don't feel like you've worked, because when you're the governor, you're governor 24/7. So I'm pretty sure that, and I caution all the young people who work at USDA, they're going to confront this when they leave. They're going to confront the feeling of, gosh, I really had a really important job, and sometimes I complained about it, but boy, I wish I had this opportunity again to affect people's lives. So I think people think that they're tired or that they don't need to put up with the aggravation or whatever, and they leave, and all of them will see, when you see them, they'll all tell you how fabulously they're doing and how well they're doing. But I know deep down inside they're going, yeah, it's just it's different. It's different.
But the piece that was in the Washington Post a couple months ago, you said that you thought about resigning.
Well, that was for a different reason.
And you felt like, what was the quote? There are days when I have literally nothing to do.
that was a different reason. Once I have something intellectually figured out in terms of the rhythm of a place, then there has to be something else in order for me to be. I had such great staff that no problems were coming to my desk. Early in the administration, there were 1,000 different problems that we inherited. and that we had to deal with. And then there were, crises like the avian influenza, or the PED virus with hogs, or the drought in California, or the forest fires everywhere. Those kinds of circumstances, you got decisions to make, and you are engaged. But I just have terrific people working at USDA that I didn't have. And they knew how I thought, and they knew how I made decisions, and they basically thought and made decisions in a way that there was no reason for me to be engaged. And so I was looking for, I don't know if this was in the Washington Post article or not, but what prompted all of this was I was home for a weekend, and actually it was a 3-day weekend, and the Monday I was at the house, and it was 7:30 in the morning, and I heard this rustling outside the house, and I thought it was contractors coming in to fix the place, because we've been in fix-up mode at the house for like forever. So I thought it was the contractors. Well, it turned out it was my then 6-year-old grandson, Jake, and he was at the door, and I opened the door, and I said, "Jake, what's up, buddy?" And he said, "Granddad," he said, "I was just thinking about you. I wonder if you'd like to come out and play." Being a grandparent's great. I mean, you get to play. You get to play. So I said, "Well, geez, buddy, I can't do it today because I've got to work." I said, then it dawned on me that it's possible that his mother didn't know he was over at the house. And I said, "Jake, does your mom know where you are?" And he goes, "No." He said, my son created a little pathway through the little forest between our two homes, and he just took the pathway. I said, "Well, we better go home. And, you tell your mom where you are so she doesn't have to worry." So we're walking back, and his little hands in my hand, and we're walking, talking about things. And he says, "Granddad, you are really old. But you know everything." And, when you have experiences like that, you begin to ask yourself, I'm sitting not having to make decisions, and here's somebody who wants to be with me. So I went to the president, told him the story, and he just said, "Well, how about if we give you more to do?" Because that's an unusual request from a cabinet member. And I said, "Great." And that's when the opioid stuff hit. And that was particularly poignant for me because of my mom's challenges with opioids and alcohol. And it turned out that I think we made a difference in terms of raising the awareness of that issue across the country. And just recently, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Bill, which is a pretty significant piece of legislation on a number of fronts, not the least of which is the additional money for opioid treatments.
So speaking of jobs, I have to share that on the elevator ride out. Somebody was on the elevator with us and he said to you, "Sure hope you come back and become governor again." Something to that effect. And I
It's
said,
a plant from the Des Moines Register,
"You're
right?
here," and I'd never seen the guy in my life. And you said, you're obviously hearing this a lot, and if you begin to hear it, I mean, is this in your thinking, that this is a possibility of running again, or?
Years ago, I made the comment that I was going to leave politics and never come back, and I realized that you have to be really careful about making those kinds of pronouncements that are so definitive that, life changes and things happen. But I don't see that in the future because I think it is I'm sort of with President Obama today, who talks about the need for developing a new generation of leaders in the country. And, and I'm particularly concerned about the state of my party in this state and in the country. And I have been saying this for a number of years, and now people are actually listening to it. I basically suggested our party was not paying the kind of attention it needed to in small towns and rural areas. And the first inkling of this is the number of state legislative bodies that Democrats have lost, the number of governors that no longer are Democrat that were, and it bubbles up. And it makes it harder to recruit people for Congress, harder to recruit people to run for the Senate, harder to have presidential candidates that have enough level of support from the country to avoid what we've seen. You can win a Polk County by 10 or 15 or 20,000 votes, but if you lose Sioux County and O'Brien County by 20,000 votes, what difference does it make? And I think, frankly, the Democrats need to do a much better job of working harder to make sure there's an understanding and appreciation for what goes on in government that that actually is beneficial to people. I am not apologetic that I work for the government. I'm not apologetic that I work for the federal government. There are 1.2 million families in this country today that over the last 8 years were able to purchase a home or refinance a home and stay in that home because of the United States Department of Agriculture partnering with them and their bank. Absent USDA's involvement, none of those families would own a home. None. Zero. Because they would not have qualified by themselves on their own for a commercial bank loan. To me, that's a positive. That gives each one of those 1.2 million families a chance to build up equity and to have some degree of comfort and security that they own their home. And interestingly enough, those loans made to those people who couldn't get a bank loan performed more effectively and more successfully during the recession than bank loans that were made by commercial banks. Then there is the 19 million Americans who live in small towns who have had their water treatment or water systems or sewage systems improved so that they have cleaner, healthier access to drinking water during this administration, or the over nearly 6 million Americans that now have access to high-speed internet, or the nearly 6 million Americans who have access to more reliable electricity because we've improved 185,000 miles of electric lines, or the nearly 20 million folks who live in small towns who have a new school, a better hospital, a mental health clinic, a daycare center, a library, a fire station, or a police station that was invested and improved by USDA resources through rural development, or the nearly 250,000 farmers, most of which were beginning farmers or socially disadvantaged farmers, who got a loan from USDA to begin operating a farm or owning a farm, or the nearly 500,000 landowners and farmers who received cost share for conservation practices on their farms, allowing their farm to be more productive over the long haul, or the nearly 40,000 recipients of grants and loans to build a local and regional food system that has supported an expansion of farmers markets, supported expansion of food hubs or farm-to-school programs that is enabling our kids to eat healthier, or the 50 million children who are in schools today that have access to more healthy and balanced meals because of what government's done. Now, that's just my department. I can't speak for anybody else in the federal government, but what I've just outlined is one department in an 8-year time period. None of that is, people are not aware of it. You go to Pocahontas, I'm told my wife was there, and she toured a school improvement project and a hospital, and she said, where did the money come from in this town that has lost a lot of population? Oh, well, USDA helped us, and it's really made a difference to our community. I don't know if those folks up in Pocahontas think of that as government, but it is. And if they don't think of it as government, then it's because we haven't made the connection effectively for them. Or the 100,000 businesses that have received a loan or grant in order to expand employment opportunities. We had a situation in Minnesota not too long ago where one of our rural development people showed up to a ribbon cutting. And the person who was the business owner was probably a fairly conservative guy, and very proud of the fact he was starting his business, and sort of looked around and he saw the rural development guy there, and he said, you know, who are you? And I'm Joe from Rural Development, United States Department of Agriculture. And he goes, well, what are you doing here? And the guy says, well, it's a ribbon cutting. We want to celebrate the new business. He said, well, government had nothing to do with this. I said, well, sir, the loan that you got, it was from the United States Department of Agriculture. It was not, he said. It was from some other organization. He said, well, yeah, but the money that organization lent to you came from the United States Department of Agriculture in a relending program. It's marketing, right? It's marketing. You got to tell folks what you're doing. And if you don't tell them what you're doing, they're assuming that it's nothing but fraud, waste, and abuse. And there's a reason for smaller government. We don't do a particularly good job of explaining that to folks and making sure that they understand the partnership that we have with them, number one. Number two, we clearly, as a party, do not express the level of appreciation for what folks in rural America do for everybody in the country. And that's a big beef of mine. I just don't think there's a full understanding. You know, there's a lot of angst about this and that involving farming and agribusiness and so forth. I get that conversation, but when you realize what we all have in this country, that every single person around this table is not a farmer, has been able not to be a farmer because you have delegated the responsibility of feeding your families to somebody else, people you don't even know. That has created this incredibly complex economy that we have, which has made us the strongest and most powerful nation on earth. You look at every of the hot spots all around the world today where there is high level of unemployment and distress and anger. It's not the religion people are following. It's the fact that they don't have a functioning agricultural economy that has allowed them to build a layered economy and allowed them to create jobs. So they have a large unemployment, especially among the men. And then they have a lot of hungry people because they don't have a system that enables them to distribute what food they do grow to the people who need it. In this country, we've got a functioning agricultural economy that's been incredibly productive. My lifetime, 170% increase in agricultural production, 26% less land, 22 million fewer farmers. It's an amazing story. And farmers are proud of what they do, but they don't think folks outside of the farming community understand what they do. Then when you walk out of that grocery store, you walk out with more of your paycheck as a percentage than virtually anybody in the world because of the system we have. We spend about 10% of our paychecks on food. Most developed countries, 20, 25%. Most developing countries can be as high as 50 to 75%. Ask yourself if you had to allocate 10% more of your paycheck for food, or 15% more, what couldn't you do or wouldn't you do that you're doing today? And have you ever thought about the connection that is to farming? Then on top of that, most of the energy source for all this electricity and all this power that you folks use in the newspaper business, where does that come from? Where does the feedstock for the energy come from? Whether it's a wind turbine, whether it's a solar panel, solar system, or whether it's coal or natural gas, pretty much comes from the rural places of this country. Then on top of all that, you got the fact that 15% of America's population contributes 35 to 40% of America's military. It's a pretty good deal. And then, they also are the preservers of most of the beautiful natural resource places that you all go to when you want to get away from it all. So, we don't appreciate them, right? It's not that being Pollyannish about this. There are obviously issues and challenges, and we have to work through those issues and challenges, and we can. But it's really hard to have the conversation you need to have when their perception is constantly putting them on the defensive. So part of what I've tried to do at USDA is to make sure that they knew that I appreciated what they did and to convey to my party the necessity of making that same pitch. If you don't, then what you're left with is a fairly receptive audience to the notion of less government and less regulation and that kind of thing. And I made the point the other day to a bunch of agricultural commissioners. They were in talking about regulation and taxes, and I said, I get you got some current concerns about regulations. I don't really quite get what you've got about the estate tax because hardly anybody pays it, but put that aside. Here's the deal. If we enter into a trade war with China and Mexico, and we create some friction in that relationship, you understand what's going to happen to the agricultural economy, don't you? 30% of our ag trade, or our ag sales, are connected directly to trade. 20% of all ag income, and our number 1 and number 3 customers are China and Mexico. And then if you throw in a few lobs of Canada, you got 1, 2, 3. You don't do a TPP, you basically 6, 7, and 8, and 9 are in TPP, and they're going to go off and do business with somebody else. I said, then, if you don't do comprehensive immigration reform, you're not going to have a workforce, because the vast majority of what we eat and consume in this country is touched at one point in time by some immigrant hand, and probably, in all probability, many of those people are not documented. So you got a situation where you guys are worried about regulations and taxes, and I think you should be as worried or more worried about market and workforce. And they looked at me like, he's got a point. So part of what we need to do, I think, I need to do, Democratic leaders need to do, is they need to think more clearly about talking to folks in rural areas. It's not that you're going to win those areas, but you just can't get beat 80-20 or 90-10. And if you have any doubt, just take a look at this is very instructive maps. Take a look at 1998 when I ran for governor and the number of counties I won. Take a look at 2002 when I ran for re-election, a tough year. Take a look at 2006 when Chet Culver won, but was really kind of an extension of our administration, because it was a great Democratic year. Take a look at 2010 and 2014 on Iowa. And then take a look at, or 14, and then take a look at the presidential races, starting with Al Gore to John Kerry to Barack Obama to now. It is a remarkable examination of what happens when you do talk to folks in rural areas and when you don't talk as effectively to them. And that's not just Iowa.
So after you leave office, what do you see as your role in Iowa politics and with the Iowa Democratic Party?
I'm more than happy to provide advice to folks. You know, I don't, I suppose I'll be a donor. But you know, I think it's a matter of making sure people are asking themselves the right set of questions and making sure that they are really thinking about how to approach Iowans and what the messaging should be. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this is a red state or a blue state. I think it's a foregone conclusion that this state's always going to be up for grabs. And but if you don't talk to folks, it makes it hard. And I think Democrats, and if you don't build the bench, if you don't really focus on everything, not just the top of the ticket, but all the way down. I mean, I got my start as a small town mayor, and that built up my credibility. So people, when I ran for the state Senate, Republicans voted for me because they knew what kind of person I was. And when I ran for governor in 1998, I was in a tough primary. That was the toughest race I ever had, and I won that race. I lost the entire state of Iowa, with the exception of my Senate district, by 2,000 votes, but I won my Senate district by 5,000 votes. The people who knew me best voted it overwhelmingly for me, and that allowed me to win the primary. And then, you know, then the general election occurred. But I think you know, there was an effort. We made an effort to talk to folks. Christie went out, Sally went out, I went out. We went to these small towns. I walked across the state when I was governor. I did town hall meetings in those small towns. It makes a big difference. People want to know you care about them. And they want to know that you're thinking about them. And they want to know that you're listening to their problems. And frankly, they don't expect you to solve every problem. They don't want you to solve every problem. But they want you to be there when they need someone, and they want a partner. And I think we can do that, and we are doing that. We just don't market it very effectively.
Based on what the president-elect has said and what he's done in terms of cabinet appointees, are there any particular Department of Agriculture programs that you think are particularly vulnerable?
Do you know something I don't know, man? He doesn't appoint a Secretary of Agriculture yet.
Oh, no, but I'm talking about his other cabinet appointments. If you look at Department of Energy, for example,
Yeah.
the impact that could have on renewable energy.
You know, I think I'm obviously. I think there have been a series of mixed signals about the renewable fuel standard, and that predated the election and has obviously not been cleared up with the appointments. And I think it'll be very interesting to see who the Secretary of Agriculture designee is. There have been a lot of names floated out there, and we'll just have to see. But I think it's unfortunate. My concern at this point is that we've only had, and I don't know if today's any different, but up until, do you know, Jess, whether or not we got anybody today from the transition team? Well, there's been one person. Well, the first guy came and he lasted about an hour, and then the lobbying rules came into effect and he left. So there's been one person coming to USDA. Now, this is an organization that has, at any point in time, somewhere between 85 and 95,000 people working for it. It's got probably 3,000 offices. Its budget is $140-ish billion. It's all over the world. And we've had one person. I mean, there are 27 different mission areas engaged in USDA. So it's a pretty
One person that's come in to talk to you and
doesn't talk to me, just one person that's been in the building.
and
Talk to my chief of staff, talk to maybe a couple other folks about, well, here's what we have set up for you on the 5th floor. We got computers all linked in. We've got binders for you, all the information about the department, the issues that are, you know, that you're going to have to probably address in the first 100 days, because there's always something that, rolls over. I remember when I started in 2009, I had seven political appointees in my shop, 7, to run this organization. I mean, we were just overwhelmed with things we had to do, and I had already started by now my own briefing of the department. I had been announced on the 17th of December, and they had me at the executive office building within days after that with massive 3-ring binders reading about the programs. So to date, there has been no transition team. There's been no smaller group of people who've been up on that 5th floor at USDA looking at all this stuff to make sure they understand what they're getting into.
What does that mean for farmers and all those people that you just talked about helping? And does that jeopardize those programs?
It doesn't jeopardize the programs, but what it can do and what can result is it can delay the implementation of things. So let me think of an example here. Well, here's an example. The GMO labeling law, which we helped to craft, which was an effort to try to provide greater transparency for consumers, at the same time not disparaging GMOs. Tough road to travel there, right? Hard. People are very passionate about that issue on all sides. But we got it done. Well, it's got to be implemented. Rules have to be produced. Study has to be done. There's a lot of internal workings that have to go into the rulemaking process, and there's a timeline. You got to do it within, there's about 1.5 years left on that timeline. Now, that may seem like a lot of time, but by the time you craft a rule, put it through the interagency process where everybody within USDA has to take a look at it, then it's the interdepartmental process and the interagency process where EPA and USTR and all the other agencies have a look at what you're doing. Then you have to go to the OMB and they have to look at it. It's a long process, right? So if you don't keep to the schedule, you won't meet the 2-year deadline. And if you don't meet the 2-year deadline, then you've got all the preemption that went into place in terms of locking Vermont's law and some of the other state laws. That may disappear. So then you got chaos in the marketplace. So it's really important that people understand what they're getting into. I mean, this is complex stuff. There's a lot of nitty-gritty that's involved in running a department like this. Now, it's not to say that they couldn't catch up in a really relatively quick period of time, and I'm assuming that eventually we're going to have people show up at our place. But it is, it's been over a month since the election, and there's a lot of work. Then there is the notion that Congress is going to think about maybe putting a farm bill together. Well, there's a lot of work involved in that in terms of providing technical assistance. And then there are folks who are constantly looking at things they want to undo or redo or change, to your point, Clark. And the SNAP program, and there's the House of Representatives went through an extended set of hearings, and they came out with their report. And here's what which we kind of told them at the beginning, but they had to we told them, number one, you may think that there are a whole lot of people gaming this system, but first of all, understand who's getting SNAP. 80% of the people receiving SNAP are senior citizens, people with severe disabilities, children, and children who live in homes where mom or dad are working. And they may be working a part-time job, they may be working a full-time job, they just are having a hard time making ends meet. So you ask yourself, first of all, as to that 80%, which of that group do you not want to help? Well, obviously, you're going to help those people. So then you say, well, what about the other 20%? Those people are called able-bodied dependents without children. And they're the people who, people say, oh, they're gaming the system, but what most people don't understand is that there's a limitation on how much help they can get. If they're not engaged in employment training and they're not engaged in a job, then they're only limited to 3 months of benefits every 36 months. So that's hardly, that's not going to take, you're not going to not get a job because you get 3 months of SNAP payments. And then people say, well, they should be working, and I agree. But what folks don't understand is the states get money from the federal government to connect the people on SNAP who the state knows. The Department of Human Services here in Iowa knows exactly who's getting SNAP. They know the name of the person, they know where they live, they know what their circumstances are. You got workforce development over here, and you got economic development who know where the jobs are being created, where the new plants are coming into place. Across the hall, talk to one another, see if you can connect those people who are able-bodied who want work with the people that are creating the jobs. Now, these people, sometimes it's hard. There may be a returning veteran who's having a little trouble reacclimating themselves to real life. That's understandable. Or it may be somebody with a criminal record who did something stupid 20 years ago but has been paying for it ever since. Or it may be somebody who would love to be able to work, but they live in a small town and their car is broken down and they have no public transportation to where the job is. So that's why I said to Congress when they put the Farm Bill together, you folks need to, A, tell the state to do a better job with the $400 million we're giving them to do that, and B, create a pilot to see if we can identify 10 states that will have the most innovative, creative, best practices on how you make those connections. So we appropriated $200 million, and we made awards to 10 states. Just an aside, Iowa did not apply. Don't ask me why they didn't apply, but they should have. They didn't apply. And states got anywhere from 15 to 20 million bucks for a couple years to try to create the better connection. We took other states that that didn't get that money, but are still very interested in doing this, and we've set up a center of excellence in Washington State. Washington State does a pretty good job of this connection. We said, hey, how about you mentor 9 other states here? So now we've got 19 states that are really working on creative approaches to this.
And the whole goal is to connect people who are receiving to jobs.
Right, so that you're not in a situation where people think everyone's gaming the system, and you're not in a situation where able-bodied folks are getting benefits without helping them try to, hardly anybody at the end of the day wants to, it's not like it's a huge benefit. It's not a very small, it's a small amount. It helps people. It's helped to remove over 4 million people from poverty. It's probably the most effective anti-recession tool that we had, because people spend that money within 30 days of getting it. So it's working, and we've seen a substantial reduction in the number of people receiving SNAP because of the improving economy. So when they did all of this research and they looked into all of this, they found out that the program's functioning pretty well. We became far more focused on integrity. We've done more investigations. We've closed more businesses that were not operating in place. And then we said, it's not just about making sure the programs run effectively. It's also about making sure the program supports healthier choices for people. So a lot of where you find poverty, persistent poverty, you don't find full-scale grocery stores. You don't find the beautiful Hy-Vee or or whatever with a friendly smile in every aisle. You find a convenience store, and that convenience store has very limited options. So we, as part of the Farm Bill, we just recently finished work on a rule that basically requires greater depth in stock. In other words, you got to have healthier choices, and you got to have more choices for people. So you go into a Casey's, you're going to begin to see, over time, you're going to begin to see more fresh fruits, more access to vegetables, less processed food.
So all convenience stores have to?
Well, if they want to accept SNAP payments, they're going to have to do that. Now, we got some pushback from the convenience store folks, and they're still not totally happy with what we've done, but we've made some improvements and listened carefully to their concerns. But the point of this is, people, just because you're on SNAP, you shouldn't be limited in terms of your access to healthy choices. That's why we've expanded EPT machines, electronic benefit transfer machines in farmers markets. We've helped finance over 60, almost 7,000 of these farmers markets now have EPT machines. And we've been working with foundations to basically allow folks to double up their bucks, so when they go to a farmer's market, they buy $5 of stuff with their SNAP card, maybe Wholesome Wave or some other foundation provides them another $5, so they end up getting $10. That helps the local and regional food system. It helps the young farmer who wants to get started, who doesn't inherit 1,000 acres, and it helps the SNAP family have access to nutritious food. It's part of creating an alternative, and that gets me back to the rural America. The other thing my party needs to do is we need to come up with better ideas on how to help improve the economy. And what this administration has attempted to do is to set up what we refer to as 4 pillars to rebuild and revitalize the rural economy. pillar number one, you have to recognize the important role that production agriculture plays and the role that exports play. So production agriculture and exports. But if it's just that, that's not enough because we got fewer and fewer farmers. So the local and regional food system creates the opportunity for smaller producers because they're not going to compete in that commodity market where you depend on what the Chicago Board of Trade and the global trading system says your corn's worth. You create something that's unique and different about your crop, or you basically sell it locally so that you are negotiating directly with your customer. And you're able to set your own price, and your customer can decide whether to pay for that price. That's what a farmer's market does, for example. And that was a $4 or $5 billion industry in 2008, 2009. It's now a $12 billion industry. And it's now projected to be a $20 billion industry in just a couple of years. So it's fast growing. 162,000 families are now engaged in that local and regional food system. Huge opportunity farm to school. Huge, huge, huge. Multi-billion dollar opportunity to sell directly to school systems. So that's an incredibly increasing market opportunity. Repopulates rural communities, brings entrepreneurship, creates opportunities for smaller producers. Conservation, obviously we talked about that, but what we haven't talked about is the notion of ecosystem markets, which is a new way of financing conservation. And an example of an ecosystem market is Coca-Cola. It decides that they want to reclaim all of the water that they produce in their products. To do that, they have to engage in conservation. They have to invest in conservation, a variety of other things. And so we get millions of dollars from Coca-Cola every year for conservation projects on public and private working lands. That's an ecosystem market. It's basically essentially using conservation to provide a corporate responsibility result. Another example, there's a power plant in it's either Oregon or Washington. They take water out of a stream and they run it through their system. They dump it back in the stream. So it's not about quality, but it's about heat. It's about the temperature of the water. And the salmon apparently like cold water, and so when it dumps back into the system after it's been treated, it's a little warmer. So it does not as good for the salmon. So an ecosystem market was created. The company was told by the government, you got to build a cooling tower to cool the water down. And somebody who was bright thought, well, shoot, why do we have to do that? Why don't we just work with local landowners along the stream there and have them plant trees? And through shade, naturally reduce the temperature of the water. We'll spend a lot less money than building a cooling tower and fixing it and repairing it. We'll do better for the environment, and the landowners should like it because it will reduce erosion. It'll provide a buffer, and it will allow them an additional source of money. That's an ecosystem market. There have been hundreds of these markets have been established for wildlife, for water quality. We also, I think, provided a conservation innovation grant here in Iowa for folks to think about the possibility of establishing an ecosystem market on water quality as a way of trying to provide incentives for people to invest in water quality. And then the final piece of this, to Clark's point, is the bio-based economy, which is moving away from an overdependence on fossil fuels and a more balanced, plant-based, fossil fuel-based economy where manufacturing, it comes back to small towns because you are using biomass to produce, you name it. Virtually everything in this room can be produced from crops, residue, or animal waste. And so you create, and we've started to track the significance of this industry, and it's now a $394 billion industry. It employs nearly 4 million people, and it has grown dramatically in this administration because we've made investments in the bio-based economy. And there is just an unlimited opportunity here. On the biofuel side, I was at Reagan National Airport a couple of weeks ago. Alaska Airlines became the first airline to have a intercontinental flight from Washington State to Washington, D.C. that was fueled with a biofuel mix that was made from wood scraps. And they have committed by 2020 to be totally dependent on biomass-produced fuel. I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on the USS Livingston with Secretary Mabus, and I watched a destroyer being refueled as part of an exercise during the week. The carrier, the destroyer, the planes were all biofuel-based. The biofuel that was going into that destroyer was made from beef tallow, from Midwestern rendering facility, beef tallow. So brave new world here. It's an amazing new world. It's a tremendous new opportunity here. So I'm hopeful that whoever gets this job next understands that 4 pillars, production agriculture, exports, local and regional food systems, conservation ecosystem, and part of that recreation and the bio-based economy can create an entirely new economy. Now, I know it's working because 3 out of 5 rural counties have seen growth. Our unemployment rate's been almost cut in half. Poverty rate's coming down faster than it has in 25 years, and the child food insecurity rate is the lowest it's ever been since we started keeping track of that. So it's beginning to work. It just needs continued investment and continued support.
So along those lines, if someone from the transition or Congress asked you what the priorities in the Farm Bill should be, are those all lines out, or what other things?
Well, first of all, the first priority would be to call it something other than a Farm Bill, because it's not just a Farm Bill. If you look at the Farm Bill, it has multiple titles. It is a conservation bill, it is a trade bill, it is a rural development bill, it is a forestry bill, it is a nutrition bill, it is a jobs bill, it's a farm bill, it's a farm credit bill. I mean, it's all of that and more. It's a research bill. So the first thing is to make sure people understand the scope of this thing. The second piece of it is to make sure that people do not start the conversation as the conversation has been started in the last couple of farm bills, which is how much money can we save? Because when you start the conversation that way, then you pit every single one of those titles against each other. You pitch the nutrition folks against the farm credit folks, the farm credit folks against the conservation folks against the rural development folks against the trade folks. You pit everybody against each other. It is a much better and more effective conversation to say, first and foremost, what is the need? Let's define the need. Let's not worry about what that cost is for the time being. Let's define the need. And if you start the conversation that way, you're going to find that there is a continued need for farm credit because commercial bankers are becoming more and more risk adverse. So there's a need for continued commitment. I think we reached, just for the second time in the history of the department, $6 billion in farm credit. Now, the farm economy, I should point this out, median farm family household income is at a record level. Now, right now, even with lower commodity prices. Median family farm household income, record level. Last 5 years, best 5 years cumulative in farm income. Exports, highest exports of agricultural products in the history of the country. So you just want to make sure that everybody understands where we are, right? And we want to maintain that. So if you define the need, you're going to have the cotton guys come in and they're going to say, you know, we like the stacks program, but it really didn't help us because we needed some help when cotton prices went down because of what occurred globally. And we thought cotton oilseed was part of the agricultural risk coverage and price loss coverage program. Actually, the way they crafted it, it wasn't. So they want that to be included in there's a cost to that. The folks at CRP say, you know, it's great that we went from 32 to 24 million acres because at the time, corn prices were $8 and, you know, soybean prices were $15. Nobody was thinking about CRP. Now people are thinking about CRP. And they should be thinking about CRP. They should always be thinking about CRP. So there may be a desire to increase the acres, not decrease the acres, though there's a cost to that. There is research. Agricultural research. You know, the reason we've been incredibly productive is because we've had phenomenal research take place. But the research for agricultural activities has been increased a little bit, but it's for the most part flatlined when compared to everything else in terms of the research area. So the research folks will come in and say, you know, really, in order for us to keep pace with the rest of the world, in order for us to continue to be innovative, in order for us to meet the challenge of climate change, whether people believe it or not, the reality is that the climate is changing and it's going to have an impact on agricultural production, a significant impact on agricultural production. You're going to have longer droughts, you're going to have heavier rains, you're going to have hotter temperatures. That is going to impact and affect where and what is grown and how long it's grown and how many growing seasons you have. You have to have research to be able to adapt and mitigate to that changing climate. So there's a need for, defining the need first and foremost, to me, is the most important thing. That will then give you the universe, the cost of all this. And then instead of saying, oh my gosh, that's just a huge number, we can't possibly do that, then let's sit down and start thinking creatively, well, how can we leverage the money we have? Our CPP is a good example. $825 million is going to result in over $2 billion of conservation. How is that possible? Well, we take the $825 million and say, what would you do if you could, it's sort of the Vision Iowa thing. What would you do if you could get this money? And we got lots of Michael Gardners out there, right? Saying, well, yeah, we could force you to, Ducks Unlimited, to put X number of dollars in, and, you know, Nature Conservancy and the Koch Foundation, all those people have money. They all want conservation for one reason or another. They're willing to put money in. So you leverage those resources, and all of a sudden you use creative thought. Our portfolio, we're dealing right now with an issue. Just two examples of this. So the Congress says to us, we love your community facility program. We love you making direct loans to communities to build fire stations, police stations, and so forth. They gave us an ever-increasing amount of money because there's no budget impact. So they could do $3 billion of loans, direct loans, and we actually make money on that. So there's no budget. So they get to go home and say, we did $3 billion of community facilities and it didn't cost a dime. Okay, fair enough. Here's the problem. In order to wisely invest all those resources, you have to have people out in the field looking for projects. Well, if you cut the budget and you cut the salaries and expense line item of the budget, you have fewer people at rural development looking for projects. So you can't spend all the money. So we said, okay, you put us in a box, we're going to get out of the box. We're going to go and we're going to say, well, let's reverse the concept. Instead of us guaranteeing a loan, let's see if somebody will guarantee our loans. So Bank of America comes up and says, well, we'll put $150 million behind this community facility program. That'll allow you to basically lend out probably 3 times that amount to what are called community development financing institutions or initiatives, CDFIs. They're operated as nonprofits. We had foundations invest money in those CDFIs so they can expand staff. Now all of a sudden, we had no problem investing all $2.2 billion because we have a large workforce. We didn't spend a single additional taxpayer dollar. So the next project is our water program. So in your paper today, you ran an article about lead. And what was interesting to me in that article was that you were talking about communities 10,000 to 50,000. Here's the problem with those communities, and we have several of them here in Iowa. We at USDA only, by law, can only do business with communities under 10,000, and for the most part, with our grant program, under 5,000. So really, really small towns. HUD can do work, but they really are focused on the bigger communities, the 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, 2 million communities. Nobody's focused on this delta right here. So I said to our team, what can we do? We don't have legislative authority, but what can we do? So we came up with this creative idea. You take a portion of our loan portfolio. We have a $212 billion loan portfolio at USDA. If we were a bank, I think we'd like be the 5th or 6th largest bank in the country. We don't do anything with that loan portfolio. A bank would basically sell participation in those loans and gather additional money and lend that additional money out so that they would be constantly generating new loans. Well, we said, well, what if we sold a participation in, say, $100 million of, just for hypothetical, $100 million of our water loans? What if we said we went out, or maybe we said $500 million. We went out and we said we're going to sell a 40% participation in $500 million in loans. So somebody will pay us $200 million to participate in these loans that will pay for the next 20 years 3% or 4%. Now, in this environment, that would be a pretty good deal for a pension plan, for an investment bank. And they would be actually anxious to do that. They would be more than happy to purchase they'd purchase the entire loan portfolio if they could. We say, well, there's one condition. Not only do you have to pay fair market value for the loans over here, the participation, and we'll administer them. We'll send you a check every time we get paid by the water district of town X. But you also have to set up your own separate fund, and you have to commit to spending or investing in 100 water projects that we can't over here at USDA can't do because it's too big in population, and HUD can't spend the time to do. Now, all of a sudden, we got a strategy for dealing with the Delta. Not a single taxpayer dime spent. This is the kind of thing, but you don't get to any of
Is this
that.
happening, or
It's,
is-
well, we're proposing it, right, and we've gone through the process. We have several investment banks very interested in doing this. We're now trying to assess what the cost is to the budget, because it's already factored in. The budgeting system in Washington DC is quite confusing. It's already factored into a certain valuation, and if you alter that valuation, sometimes you have to have PAYGO. You have to offset it with something. But we haven't quite figured out what the PAYGO is yet. But we're one step away from getting this done. We got Treasury to sign off. OMB wants to do it. We want to do it. The private sector wants to do it, and surely there must be a lot of communities out there that would love to have us do it. And it's a pilot that would allow us to basically leverage without any risk to the taxpayers, providing more assistance. Now, you don't get to any of those conversations if you start off by saying, we got to save money. Because when you start that conversation, all of the energy is focused on Reka's priority against my priority against everyone's priority in this room. And all of a sudden, we're all fighting with each other, and nobody's sitting around the table going, okay, we all have defined the need. Now how can we be creative to meet the need? Seems to me that's a much better conversation and a much more productive conversation. But I don't know if the next Congress, the next administration, or the next Secretary of Agriculture will do that. But that's what you asked, what the priority should be. That's how it should be approached.
How would you change crop insurance?
How would I what?
Just change the crop insurance program.
Well, we've already changed it significantly. You understand that, right? We saved $6.5 billion by doing an actuarial study of how much money the crop insurance companies were getting paid and how much they were paying out and what they needed in order to maintain solvency. It turns out that they needed somewhere between 12 and 14% return on their money, and they were getting anywhere from 17 to 21%. So we said, you know what? That's too sweet a deal. Scale it back. We just recently made some changes in preventative planning where, it's one thing to basically buy crop insurance in land and you get flooded out and you need help getting back on your feet. But if you've got land that is consistently flooding out every year, maybe that's land that we shouldn't be in the program. So we've made some changes there. There are probably some refinements that could be made in terms of certain levels of coverage and how much the government subsidizes those coverages. There is, I think, a tendency on the part of people to think, well, we shouldn't subsidize crop insurance at all. Here's the problem. If you didn't subsidize it, nobody would buy it. When nobody would buy it, there would be a drought like there was in 2012 here in the state. And just understand that if you think that you could have a drought the extent to which we had in 2012 and not have people run to Congress asking for an emergency declaration and assistance, you're crazy. And if you think people would somehow resist that in an election year of providing that emergency package, you're crazy. And if you think that people wouldn't think, well, gosh, that's a must-pass bill, so I'm going to add my little piece of something that's not related to crop insurance onto that bill, you're even crazier. And if you think that the crop insurance program is expensive today, try the alternative. You would actually spend more money with the alternative. So it's really a bargain in the sense of farmer, taxpayer, insurance company. That's not bargain in the sense of we're getting something for nothing, but bargain in the sense of people working collaboratively together in an effort to try to minimize the cost to taxpayers overall from natural disasters that occur.
I get that. There are a lot of groups out there that are saying that more changes need to be made, especially those that can encourage conservation. Maybe, farmers get a break if they enact certain conservation practices. There's concerns about, people are, that some of the crop insurance discourages planting of cover crops, for example. Things like that
Well,
can be changed.
I would say, first of all, we have conservation compliance, so you have to have a conservation plan in order to be able to get crop insurance to begin with. So there is, and we have tightened that up in response to the first piece. And the second piece, in terms of cover crops, the issue with cover crops isn't so much crop insurance. Is it's hard to say to a farmer, man, we want you to plant a cover crop, and he goes, okay, that's going to be $30 an acre. What do I do with the cover crop? Do I sell it? Well, there's no market for it. We just want you to incur that expense because we think it'd be a good idea for you to have a cover crop because it would actually retain the moisture and it would make healthier soil. And over time, you might, your son or your son's son or your daughter's granddaughter might benefit from that. It's a hard case economically, especially when you're looking at some of these smaller sized operations. So you got to kind of make it so that it makes sense for them economically. So that's why we are into the biomass, converting it into bio-based products, because you can create market opportunities for the cover crop. Or that's why we see this as part of our ecosystem market system, where you say to a Chevrolet, hey, you guys say you want to sort of reduce your carbon footprint. Well, one way you can reduce that carbon footprint is to invest in cover crop in a working ranch or a working farming operation in Iowa. And we just recently closed a deal with Chevrolet providing voluntary carbon credits in that kind of mechanism. So there are ways to get there, which we are exploring. But I think the issue with cover crops isn't so much crop insurance, but we've also provided an expansion of crop insurance, a significant expansion of the number of crops covered and the type of crops that can be covered, including some cover crops, including some energy crops. And we've also created the whole farm revenue policy that basically if you're a small producer and you're producing 5 or 6 different crops, but not enough of any one crop to need a crop insurance policy for that particular crop, you now can buy an insurance policy for your entire farm, which supports more diversified farming operations. I think the key for me in the future, is diversity. I think, if somebody were to ask, well, where do you see the future of farming? I see it in diversity. Diversity of size of operations, diversity in terms of who the operators are, diversity in terms of what's grown, and diversity in terms of the production methods. And I think what we've seen in the last 8 years is a growing acceptance on the part of more farmers and farming organizations of, yeah, that's right. It's not, when I came into office, the notion of us spent a lot of time on organic, people would have they got all concerned about it. I said, look, don't be concerned about this. It's a high value-added proposition. It's the way young people can get started. It's the way you can start small. And that way you can repopulate rural communities. It's the way of bringing entrepreneurship. And by the way, there's a huge demand for it out there. Not everybody can pay for it. Not everybody can afford it. But some people can and they want it. And now there's a tremendous demand for organic. That is creating opportunities. And I think there's also, frankly, an opportunity for us to create trading relationships with other countries that we have been on the outs with through organic farming. I think of Cuba, for example. So diversity, I think, is critically important. And I think this diversity is going to be the answer to how do we continue to grow what we need in this country and continue to be a food secure nation, unlike any other in the world, where we can grow what we need with warmer temperatures and changing growing seasons.
Speaking of relationships with other countries, what's your reaction to Governor Branstad being named subject to confirmation the ambassador to China?
It's my favorite appointment. And I'm serious about this. I think that is an appointment that to me made sense. It made sense because China is our #1 ag customer, and they buy a lot of what Iowa raises. Buy a lot of soybeans, buy some pork, and certainly an ambassador has to be a salesperson for the country and for the country's products. And I think everyone will agree that Governor Branstad is a salesman. He's proud of whatever he's connected to, and he's proud to sell it. And he's energetic at it. all of those, I think, are incredibly important characteristics of a successful ambassador in China. Plus, he's tenacious, and he's going to require a lot of tenacity and patience with these people. They don't move. They move only when they are ready to move. So you have to be patient, and you have to look for the opportunity there. Chinese are merchants, and they think like merchants, and you have to understand what how they think. And I think Governor Branstad, because of his personal relationship with President Xi, at least as long as President Xi is president, is in a good position to use that relationship. So I'm hopeful that Congress, I hope that the appointment process that he has to go through is one that doesn't delay his appointment, because I think we need a strong ambassador in China.
Which is your least favorite appointment, sorry.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Do you think the renewable fuel standard is in jeopardy with Pruitt and Perry?
I don't know if it's. I'll just say this personally. I have concerns about it. I've had concerns about it because there has been an ongoing effort on the part of the oil industry to get rid of the renewable fuel standard, and it's been comprehensive. It's been comprehensive. They've attacked it in the regulatory system, they've attacked it in the courts, and they've attacked it in the court of public opinion. So I think people who are supportive of the renewable fuels standard should be incredibly vigilant now. We've gotten to a point where the EPA has announced the 2017 numbers, and we got up to $15 billion for conventional ethanol, which was a goal. We're making some progress on second and third generation fuels. We just need to continue to stay the course, because it's incredibly important to the economy of rural America.
You said that the voters, we need to hear more marketing about the good things that are happening in rural America. I mean, it seems like the economic erosion has been extremely steep and I guess persistent, and despite the gains that you've said that we've seen, I don't think we're seeing that in rural America.
Well, I think you are seeing it. You just aren't recognizing it. You can't. The data is what the data is. 3 out of 5 counties, rural counties in this country, have seen growth.
But in a very practical sense, people don't think that their children will stay in rural areas.
That's because see, that's the storyline that you all have bought into, and you shouldn't buy into it. You shouldn't buy into it, because there is an alternative, and that alternative is working in a lot of places. I will take you to coal country in Kentucky, and I will take you to communities that are beginning to see the possibilities, and they have really been hit hard. But through Strike Force, we established at USDA. We just established a process by which we are focused on the 970 of the poorest and most persistently poor counties in the country, and we are rural counties, and we're focused on trying to help those folks understand how they can access assistance, and we've done over 200,000 investments in those counties since I've been secretary. We have an incredible activity going on in Pine Ridge, which, if you want to see poverty, that's a place you can go to and see poverty. And we now have suggested to them, look, you're a nation to nation, you want to have a nation to nation conversation, so let's treat Pine Ridge as a nation. Every nation has an economy. What is your economy? They don't have an economy up there. They have tremendous agricultural opportunity, but they have not fully utilized it because they have fractionated land, and they don't even know who all owns the land up there. So we have mapped out the entire reservation. We have figured out who owns what. We've figured out what land is conducive to agricultural production, and we've begun the process of putting together a plan to create an economy that is producing native traditional foods that Native Americans would want and are interested in having, that they have hard time accessing, and be able to process and package those foods that are being produced on the reservation, and then exporting them. Just as we export to China, they would export to Nebraska or to Iowa or to Minnesota. So there is progress being made. And I know that I'm pushing a rock up a large hill here because of the attitude that you've just expressed, which I know is out there. But the real reality on the ground is things are happening. Things are happening. But-
But you, I mean, I think part of what she's reflecting, there is real reason for anxiety about the loss of population and opportunity in rural areas.
Well, sure, there,
And-
over the
and
last
you-
30 years or 40 years, but it's we're beginning to reverse it. It's sort of, none of this stuff happens overnight. It just doesn't happen overnight. But it's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen all over the country. One of the things that's made a difference is, I can tell you that our rural development resources last year, 50% of our rural development resources were invested in the census tracts where poverty rates were 20% or higher. That's never happened before. I can tell you that when I came into this job, I asked to see where we were investing money in rural development. What was the previous administration doing? And here's what I found. Restaurants, hotels, police stations, police cars, and ammunition. Substantial amount of money invested in those areas. Now, the message that I got in looking at those investments was, gosh, rural America is a great place to visit, but why would you want to live there? But if you did live there, you'd probably be reasonably safe. There wasn't a message of hope that there is today. The message that we've conveyed is that there's a strategy, there's a plan. Now, you have to constantly drumbeat, you have to constantly market it, you have to constantly remind people. You don't realize you're really informed people. You are genuinely informed people. But I guarantee you that had you not listened to me in previous circumstances, you wouldn't have a clue how much money the USDA has invested in Iowa since I've been secretary. You wouldn't have a clue. You'd be like Governor Branstad, who said, well, $25 million. I said, no, Governor, since the time I've been secretary. Oh, $100 million. No, Governor, it's $30 billion. $30 billion. And I can show you, we have a sheet, we can get it for you, that shows exactly where all that money went. But we don't market it. So when someone gets a single-family home, somebody gets a business loan, somebody gets a REAP grant, somebody gets a conservation payment, they don't think of it as, gosh, this is investing in my community.
But isn't it fair to say that, for good reason, you're focused on solutions and these programs that really are having a positive effect, but the people that you're reaching out to, I mean, they're just faced with this reality that need exists, and that might account for this different perception that you're talking about.
Well, right, because we haven't sat down with them and made the connection with them. We haven't explained the partnership. We've just sort of done it recently. And it's been a recent phenomenon. Prior to this administration, we didn't. And frankly, it goes back to the earlier question of, well, why do people leave after 2 or 3 years in a job? Well, there are lots of reasons they leave, but if you stick this out for 8 years, you can make a heck of an impact.
Yeah.
And it's just, I truly believe that there are better days ahead for rural, not for every community. And it requires tremendous local leadership. It requires state leadership. It requires a different conversation than the one we've been having in this country for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. If Democrats don't do what I'm telling them to do, then clearly the alternative messaging of we need less government because it doesn't work, there's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, everybody's getting something I'm not getting, and it's not fair, that's going to continue to pervade the thought process. But if we do our job and provide a counter message that essentially says, well, wait a second, how about all those home loans we made in your community? How about that new water system? How about that business that we helped to create? Doesn't that create a sense of optimism? I was at West Point, Iowa, 2 months ago. Little welding manufacturing facility just outside of West Point, Pilot Grove. They just invested in a new solar system, and they're going to be able to have all their energy produced from this doggone solar system, and it was an operation from Fairfield that we had provided some resources to. I mean, there's a lot of progress going here, but it doesn't get reported. It doesn't get highlighted. It doesn't get highlighted in the same way that, a plant closing gets highlighted. It's the same thing with trade. And I know I've weared out my welcome here, but I'll just 2 more minutes. It's the same thing with trade. I get that people think we've sort of lost on trade, but people are confusing trade from globalization. Those are two different things. Trade's part of globalization, but it's not all of globalization. All these machines you all are using have changed the way your business operates, and it has affected jobs in a real way. It's affected how many jobs you have in a real way. Is that globalization? No, but people have a tendency to think it's part of it. What we haven't done, and this is maybe the most important thing I can say. The failure of government in this conversation, in my view, is not only that we haven't marketed what we do particularly well, but we've been all about innovation. We've been all, it's really exciting. Uber's got a driverless car operating in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I'm thinking, as a former cab driver, that's how I got myself through school, wait a second, what are we going to do with the cab drivers? What are we going to do with the truck drivers? What are we going to do with the bus drivers? That's the question that hasn't been answered. It's answered after the fact. It's like, oh, we'll have a trade assistance program, or we'll have a worker training. No, you have to be able to go into those industries and into those communities and say, as we did in Newton, when Newton's never recovered from Maytag completely, but they're in better shape than they would have been, because I went there as governor and said, you know what, we're going to give you $10 million. We're going to let you, here's $10 million bucks. We're going to try to help you create a plan for this transition. That doesn't happen everywhere where there's a plant closing, where there is where the coal industry gets declining over a period of decades. That didn't happen. If it did, we'd be in a much different situation. If somebody come in and say, look, here's the deal, guys. There's a cheaper form of this, or there's a better form of this, or there's going to be environmental concerns about this, so there's going to be a transition, and it's going to be very disruptive. We get this, and you're going to be upset about it. But we're going to work with you to create an alternative. We didn't do that. We just didn't do it. And we didn't do it explicitly enough, and we didn't do it specifically enough. And the same thing happened in agriculture. 22 million fewer farmers from 1950 to today. 22 million fewer farmers. We didn't say, well, wait a second, what are we going to do with those people? Well, we're going to move them to the city. Okay. Is the city prepared for it? Do we have jobs for them? Are we going to have the infrastructure? We didn't do that. Or should we have said, hey, you know what, before they move to the city, at least let's give them an opportunity, if they want, to stay or come back? There wasn't a transition. There wasn't a transition strategy. There now is a transition strategy, if the next administration will continue, or they may put a slightly different twist on it. But there needs to be a strategy that we're committed to as a country. Not that we want to stop innovation, or we want to stop change, or we want to delay it. None of that. But we want to make sure we analyze its impact and help the people who are going to be negatively impacted by this. And we just haven't done that. And Democrats have, I think, a particular responsibility, because we're supposed to be the party of opportunity and the party of community. Well, community needs to step up. They need to explain what the opportunity is, and if they haven't figured it out, they need to figure it out. And we need to be looking at all of the businesses and all of the industries that are going to change.
That's a tough message for somebody running for office to say, hey, this automation is coming. Some of you are going to lose your jobs, but we're going to come up with a strategy to do something.
It wasn't in 1998. I mean, I realize I won for a lot of reasons, and I was lucky. I get that. But I had a strategy. I said to the people of Iowa, we're going to make Iowa the food capital. I'll never forget this. David Axelrod was my media guy. And he said, nobody knows what you're talking about. I said, well, I know what I'm talking about. We're going to basically convert this stuff I'm talking about now, the bio-based economy. That's what I was talking about. He said, nobody knows what it's talking about. So they went out and they, without my permission, they polled it. They put it in a poll. They put a question in a poll. So, do you favor class size reduction and property tax relief? And by the way, do you know what this knucklehead's talking about when he says food capital? 7% of Iowans were with me on this. 7, not 70, 7. And he told me, he says, stop talking about this. I didn't stop talking about it. And the reason I didn't stop talking about it is because it conveyed to people, they didn't quite understand it, but it conveyed to people, you know, he's thinking about this. He's got a plan. We do not convey the notion that we have a plan. We just don't. I mean, politicians show up for the ribbon cutting. You know, we're all excited about that, but that's not part of a plan. What is the strategy? Vision Iowa was a strategy. It was a plan. It was to say, here we're going to leverage money, we're going to create more attractive communities. And you know, I remember the census person coming into me from the state library and says, well, Governor, congratulations, for the first time in 70 years, Iowa has reversed the outmigration. Now, it didn't last very long, because different administration, but while I was governor, we reversed the outmigration because we had a plan. So I'm a strong believer in this, and I will push back hard on the notion that it's not working. It may not be perceived, but it's working. But you got to have a plan, and you have to have a strategy, and you have to invest in that strategy. And if we go back to investing in police cars and convenience stores and hotels and restaurants, you will basically be writing off rural America, and you shouldn't do that. I got it.
Do you have a plan after you leave office, or are you still formulating?
I have a plan, I just can't talk about it.
You have decided where you're going to land and what you're going to do?
Decided that we want to spend a lot of time in Iowa because our grandkids are here, and we want to spend time in Colorado because our grandson is here, and obviously our children, daughters-in-law, and our friends, and we want to spend some time in Washington, D.C.
But professionally?
Well, that's the plan, and hopefully I get a chance to continue to be involved in agriculture in some way, or agricultural policy, and hopefully I'm able to be around incredibly bright young people.
And I asked you if there was a university post in your future. Is there?
I wouldn't say post, but a connection.